Good morning. Let's see, can you hear me? Okay, folks are still trickling in, but I'm gonna go ahead and get started because we have a really jam-packed morning for everyone. So welcome to the final day of the 2021 New Clinicians Conference. You've made it. You're in for a real treat today as you're gonna be hearing from two gems, Carwina, Weng and Laila, Hlass, about best practices in clinic design. But before we get started, just a few announcements, but that by now you're probably very familiar with. This session is being recorded, so feel free to leave your video off if you're more comfortable. The small groups will be meeting today after the session, beginning at 12:15. Hopefully you know your small group by now, but if not, I will put the contact information for Lisa Martin in the chat in just a moment so you can connect with her. Please mute yourself unless you're asking a question. We're going to save questions towards the end, and we ask you if you have questions to go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try and respond to them as they come up in the chat or at the very end, time permitting. And we apologize in advance if any questions go unanswered. Materials for this session and all of the conference sessions can be found on the CLIA New Clinicians Google Drive, and I will also put the link for that in the chat in just a moment. I would like to briefly introduce our great speakers that we have today. Laila Hlass is the Director of Experiential Learning and the Co-Director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Tulane Law School. And we have Carwina Weng, who's the Clinical Professor and Director of the Community Legal Clinic at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law. And so with that, I will turn it over to them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicole, and great to see all of these faces, including I see one of my trivia mates on the screen, and we're just still celebrating our victory of our best origin story. So great to talk clinic design with you all. Like good clinicians, we are going to use backward design. We are going to start with goals and then kind of like work our way back to how to get to those goals. And so our goal for you today is that you can design a clinic seminar from scratch. And we're really going to focus on designing one unit or one class or one topic, because that's kind of how you can then build out a whole course. So we're going to kick off this session with a poll to get a better sense of everyone who's in the room. Great. So there are a few questions here. We encourage you to fill them out, and then we can share and just kind of get a room temperature of kind of, what you're hoping to get out of this session, how many years of experience you have. And hopefully we're going to build this course in a way, or this kind of little seminar in a way that no matter where you're at, we think you can benefit from it in kind of designing the class or course that you're thinking about. We also are gonna, in the chat, encourage folks to introduce themselves, and I'll start out. So if you can kind of write your name, what you teach, and then we're gonna add something fun, like what you're looking forward to this summer. I'm going on a trip to see the national parks, including the Grand Canyon, which I'm really excited about. But please, others, introduce yourself so we can get to know a little bit more about you as well. Great, and I see that we're at almost full participation with our poll, so I'm just gonna share the results. It looks like we're kind of split about half and half if we've already done a course design, and it looks like everybody wants to do everything, so that's great, and a mix of years as well, but a vast majority of us are just 0 to 3 years of experience. And excitingly, lots of you are planning to do a fair mix of skills, substantive law theory, and values. I like doing that as well. So great to get a little bit from you. So we are going to, I'll kind of like break down what we're going to do today, and I'll kind of, this is us. And so we're going to spend today giving you a little bit of a framework for how to think about designing, as I said, kind of like one unit, and thinking about learning goals, and then kind of the steps that you're going to take to design that one class. And then we're going to do some exercises, thinking about goals, as well as eventually breaking you all out in groups and getting you to talk to each other about some of the activities that you're going to think about. So you already heard my formal introduction, but I'll tell you just a little bit more about kind of myself and clinic design. I'm currently, as mentioned, I'm co-directing the Immigrant Rights Clinic with Mary Yannick at Tulane Law School. But I've taught in a lot of different law schools in a lot of different capacities. I started as a staff attorney, and I got to design my first class there, just one class. I've been a teaching fellow, and I also was at BU, where I directed a clinic and had the opportunity to teach with Sarah Sherman Stokes and others. And I've taught year-long, semester-long, like, you know, varying amounts of credits, and all of that is implicated in like what you can do and how you design. So we're going to give you a framework, but obviously it's a little bit different for everyone. If you have 10 credits in one semester, Georgetown, when I was there, or if you have, you know, 3 credits per semester, or 12 credits for a full year, everything is different. I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter to get started with our framework.
Thanks, Laila. Thanks, Nicole. And thanks to all of you for joining. This is exciting to see so many people here. And I noticed that you're not all new clinicians, which is great. It's in some ways, I think learning to design a clinic intentionally works better when you've had a little teaching experience. But that doesn't mean if you haven't done it before that you should feel worried about this. My name's Carwina. As Laila said, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a bit of a clinical pedagogy geek. I love designing clinics. I love assessment. I am totally considered weird at my school. So welcome to my world. I am putting in the chat for everyone, first of all, a link to a video that I did as part of the clinical legal education section's meeting a couple weeks ago that gives you an overview of the learning design process that I use and created with my dear friends, Danielle Cover at Wyoming, Meg Reuter at UMKC, and Chris Roberts at UT Austin. So that is just a resource for you to look at later. We're not going to go over all of it in detail today because 1 hour is just really a short time. What I want to start with, though, is a little bit of a big picture, why we actually want to design clinics and how that fits into the world of ABA accreditation. So the ABA has finally caught up with the rest of the world on pedagogy, saying that students will learn best when teachers are transparent about what it is they want students to achieve and have clear, measurable, and observable program goals and learning outcomes. So the ABA has set some outcomes that are required of all accredited schools. And these include things around legal knowledge, typical learning skills like analysis, research, problem solving, and communication, ethics, and then some of the more lawyering skills oriented pieces, you know, whether it's trial advocacy, interviewing, counseling, cultural competence, or self-evaluation. It also requires that every single teacher creates a syllabus that includes the learning outcomes for their particular course. And ideally, those learning outcomes and goals are going to align with the school's outcomes and goals, which of course have to include the ABA's outcomes. So we design courses in order to achieve alignment. And this pyramid shows sort of that course of alignment. The key focal point, the starting point is the tip of the triangle where your program goals and learning outcomes are. And then as you get broader and broader with more and more courses and units, each of those should align in some part, preferably a fair amount, with the program goals and learning outcomes. Next slide, please, Laila. I want to differentiate a little bit between goals and outcomes because that gets very confusing. Goals are the broader statement. Okay, it's sort of like what overall is your student going to be able to achieve at the end of your course? And that should be some combination of everything that they're learning in your course, whether it's knowledge, skills, or values. And so you're thinking about a vaguer statement, something like, by the end of torts, your students, my students will understand how societies regulate behavior in a civil context. That's a little bit wordy, but you have that word understand. And the problem with that goal is it's hard to know exactly what understand means, because we show a lot of there are different ways that we will show understanding, and that's where the outcomes are going to come in. So outcomes are more specific. They're going to be very observable and measurable. Like with understanding, it might be by the end of this course, you will be able to explain the difference between intentional torts and negligence. Or by the end of the course, you will be able to apply the torts law that you have learned to a new fact situation. That's sort of like your issue spotting exam. So outcomes are the building blocks that students are going to need in order to achieve your goals at the end of the course. Okay, next slide, please. To make sure that all that happens, I use at least this experiential learning design process, which, as Laila said, is based on backward design or understanding by design, a process developed for K-12 schools by Weng and McT. It's a cycle, and it's an iterative cycle. So I'm not going to go through all of it right now, but the three main buckets are grounding the course, which is sort of like why, what is important about this course and why should students take it? Framing the course, which is sort of the what are they going to look like at the end of this class? And building the course, which is the how actually are you going to achieve all of those learning goals? Okay. And it's backwards, as Laila said, because we're starting with our goals and then moving through the learning materials to achieve that. That way we can assure that we are choosing activities, whether they are field placement work, client work, learning activities in the classroom, supervision meetings, all of that. We choose those to help the students achieve the learning outcomes and goals, not the other way around. Like we might really enjoy one exercise. I, for example, really like to use improv exercises in my class, but if they don't actually advance my students' learning towards the goal, then I shouldn't do it just because I think it's fun. Okay, next slide, please, then. The other hard part, like I said, when you're thinking about fun exercises and alignment is you can't possibly cover everything. There is just too much going on. I, for example, teach a litigation-oriented clinic, community legal clinic. We used to do full representation family law. If you think about everything that goes into making a person a good lawyer in a family law context, it's going to run the gamut from being able to handle emotions, including a client crying or shouting during a meeting or in court, to actually being able to do the more bespoke lawyering things like putting together a case theory, advocating in court, presenting an oral argument, knowing your evidence and objecting properly, all of that. You can't cover all of it in my 1 3-credit semester class. Okay, so we have to set learning priorities. And I love this little concentric circle set from Wiggins and McT because it helps you to think about, again, what it is you really want students to learn. In the middle, your enduring understanding. This is the key. What are the students going to remember 10 years after they leave your class? What is it they're going to be able to start using right away? Okay. I like to use civil procedure. Okay. I don't practice in federal court. It has, I admit, been over 30 years since I took civil procedure. I know there are rules out there. I kind of remember 12b-6 and sort of where the discovery rules are, but do not ask me really what any of the rules say, because it didn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's not the enduring understanding that I needed to take away and have not taken with me from civil procedure at all. I needed to know that level of detail for the exam, and then I promptly forgot it all. So instead, I might want to think, what really matters? What should I take away from civil procedure? I know where to find the rules if I ever find myself in federal court so that I can try to follow the rules. And I also know that if I screw up, I'm going to call the court clerk. So sort of those things. Next, circle out what's important to know, do, and value. Okay. In my family law clinic, that might be where the law is. I need them to be able to really understand where to find the law and how to use it for the purposes of that clinic, because otherwise we're not going to do a very good job for our clients. And then the last part is worth being familiar with. Sometimes I admit I put the law there. I would say some of that in my family law litigation clinic would be the local rules. They need to know them again for that semester, but most of our students are not going to do family law. Most of them are not going to practice in Monroe County, Indiana. It's okay if they don't really remember any of that after they leave my class. So when you're trying to figure out goals, learning outcomes, think in part about what your priorities. What really do you want your students to be able to do long after they've left the class? And that will help you take some of the concrete things you're doing, set your priorities, and turn those into goals. Okay, Laila, next slide, please. So one of the ways we think about what our core priorities are in learning and how we then start developing goals and outcomes is to think through mastery evidence. I like to visualize my student at the end of the course, at the end of the unit, whatever the scale may be. And I'm thinking, I want them to understand something. What does that really look like? What are they going to be able to do for me or for their clients? And that's the mastery evidence, how they're going to show me that they're making progress and actually may have learned the skill at the level I want them to learn at the end of the course. So Wiggins and McTee break down understanding into these 6 categories. They don't see them as hierarchical. If you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, Bloom's taxonomy does turn these more into hierarchies of learning, with the idea that some of them are higher level orders of cognition. Like you can think if you can memorize and spit back something, that takes less cognitive load than being able to apply a set of laws to a new situation. But that's what we're looking at. Can a student explain something to me? Can they explain what Rule 12b-6 is? Interpret data, text, and experiences. Can they interpret how that might be have been applied in a case that they're reading? Apply it. Can they now take the 12b-6 rule and apply it to their own case? Can they demonstrate perspective? How do they see that 12b-6 motion? How does their adversary see it? How is the court going to see it? Can they display empathy? Oh, won't that person feel bad, the defendant, when we win that 12b-6 motion? Okay, maybe not as realistic. And then demonstrate self-knowledge. How is it that I, as a student, figured out what it means to give to state a claim or not state a claim? What helped me understand that? How did I read the court rules? How did I read the court opinions? How did I use the conversation with my supervisor, my classmates, to better understand that? That kind of piece. That's what we're looking for. And you would use these kinds of verbs to set your learning outcomes and goals, because that way a student looking at those outcomes and goals would be able to understand better. See, I use that word myself, what they're expected to do. Understand is too vague. It's okay in a goal. Concrete action verbs are much more useful to help the students figure out where they're headed. All right. Next step then. A major piece of backward design then is assessment, because that assessment is part of how we're thinking about that student. What really do we want them to know? How are we going to know that they've achieved the goals we've set for them? A good assessment is going to fit these 3 criteria. And you'll see I have pictures. One is an interview on top, one is a multiple choice question. Those go to my first point. A good assessment is authentic. It requires students to do what an expert, you the instructor, would do in realistic situations. We all know in a clinic class, probably the last thing we're going to want to do is give a multiple choice exam, because that's not what lawyers do. That, of course, is also why we shouldn't use that perhaps on the LSAT, but anyway, or the bar exam, that's a totally different conversation. Rather, we want students to use the skills and the knowledge we're giving them in the clinic the way we use them in the real world as lawyers. So instead of giving students a multiple choice exam, we might be asking them to do an interview. It might be a simulated interview. It might be a real client interview, and we'd be observing that. Okay. We might, if we don't have those resources, give them at least a CAT interview, and then they could answer certain questions about it, giving feedback about what works or what doesn't work, because that's also more realistic. And we like that kind of role play or actual client work because it's complex. It's requiring students to put together everything they've learned in the interviewing unit about how to ask questions, how to be present with the client, how to use the law that they've learned to interview a client and get the information they need to represent that client well. And because it's happening perhaps in a simulation or live time, it's challenging. You can't just say, oh, if I were that lawyer, I would ask the client this, right? That's what our colleagues do in their doctrinal classes. Rather, it's making them do it in real time, using their judgment and thinking, oh, I wasn't expecting that kind of information. How do I follow up? So the assessment puts our students, as we always do in clinics anyway, in real situations that are realistic to the practice of law. And that's the best way for them to be learning and for us to seeing what they've learned. Okay, next slide then. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit fast and maybe over time already. So learning outcomes. This is the key part. This is what students will pay more attention to than the goal. And we use this process called ABCD to write a learning outcome. A for who? Our students. B, the behavior. Those are where our action verbs come in. What are they doing? Condition. What are the circumstances that they're doing it in? And degree, how much or how well are they doing it? So here's an example. Students will be able to incorporate multiple perspectives into their case theories with limited input from the instructor. Okay, there are a lot of other learning outcomes, of course, that we could have in an interviewing process, but or in a lawyering class, but it at least gives the students a very clear indication of what they're doing. We want them to be able, for example, to problem solve by thinking about not just their client and their view, but the judge's view and other people's view, or in a negotiation, what the other side is thinking about, who the other stakeholders are. So that very specific learning outcome tells the students what they're expected to do. And by the end of the course, that they are mostly doing that independently. All right, next slide. This then is an example from one of my units on interviewing. I'll give you the goal. By the end of the unit, students will be both present with their clients and prepared to gather relevant information. You see, I have roughly two types of goals. One is an affective goal about being present, and one is more a cognitive goal, being prepared in terms of what the law is, what kinds of questions they may be asking, what kind of housekeeping they may have to give in terms of confidentiality, next steps, and so on. I break that down into about 6 learning outcomes, and I don't want more than that because, again, I'm prioritizing. So students will be able to listen actively, will be able to respond with cultural appropriateness, will be able to withhold judgment, we'll be able to brainstorm at least 5 areas of inquiry. We're shifting now into sort of the preparation pieces. We'll be able to script out T-funnel questions in each area, and we'll be able to interact without reading their scripts. Okay, so that would be a way that I would align my learning outcomes with the goal. And Laila, yes, we're ready for the next one. It is your turn now to practice. I'm sorry, I'm running really fast and in fact behind, but choose a unit on either persuasion or reflective practice. And you're going to draft a goal for that unit and at least 2 learning outcomes using the ABCD process that we're suggesting. I'm going to give you a worksheet in the chat. That's a link that will help you sort of remember what to do with it. It's a nice, useful worksheet to keep. You can use it at any time after this. We've actually also suggested in the small group breakouts that you might use this again if you do another unit. But we're going to take just about 5 minutes total to go through that. Don't worry about them being perfect at all. This is just to get some initial practice using the ABCD framework.
Some folks mentioned they're having trouble getting the worksheet. So what I'm going to do is upload it really quickly to the Google Drive, and I'll put that link in the chat as well. So that will be another way to get the worksheet. Just 1 second.
Also, folks can just feel free to sketch out on a piece of paper, even, without looking at the worksheet, just, what would a learning goal be with one of these topics? And then try to think about, a couple outcomes.
And Laila, maybe we move back to that slide just so it'll be on the share screen also. Thanks. Back one more. There we go.
So I'm gonna ask people to start just typing in the chat a learning outcome that they came up with. And people can also continue to introduce themselves. I'm getting a lot of joy out of seeing these summer plans, particularly the ones where you're seeing family you haven't seen in years, or new babies, and all of it. I'm here for all of it. But yeah, if folks could just start throwing up in the chat some of the, like, a learning outcome that they came up with, that'd be great. Okay, I'm going to encourage folks to just type them in, but I'm going to also continue. I think it's just great to kind of like learn from each other. They don't have to be perfect, but even just practicing the skill, just like we do with our students, can help you think about how to come up with these learning goals. This is great. Thanks, y'all. So I think I'm gonna go into teaching interviewing. I'm gonna kind of try to do a little bit of a detailed case study, thinking about a unit, interviewing classes, and talking through what some of my learning goals are, and then also talking through the planning that went through with the class. So I'm going to transport myself back in time and tell you about when I first started my first kind of directing position at BU. I was joining a clinic that had grown its case docket to more than 100 cases. And so we were, trying to figure out how can I implement a new vision, and keeping in mind kind of what cases we would want to add, and then how to complement, or as Carwina was saying, how to align the seminar, thinking about perhaps the cases we're going to focus on, and what I wanted the students to learn. I was very lucky to be teaching with Sarah Sherman-Stokes at that time. And we kind of just started brainstorming in the summer. And so we started with goals. What are the major things that we think our students need to learn? What are the things that we think are most important for them as immigration lawyers? And essentially made a list at least as long, with topics as least as long as the number of classes we had, because perhaps like one class would be a unit or a topic, although like with interviewing I ended up spending several classes on. And then, I tend, as a number of people do, to kind of do a boot camp where I put a lot of the substantive law that I think is kind of like core at the very beginning of the class. And then I plan to use my supervision to really expand upon kind of the substantive law and like legal research, so that I can focus the course mostly on skills and kind of like theoretical understanding of their roles as lawyers. And so When we planned out the whole course, we thought a little bit about kind of chronologically, and again, this kind of goes to that alignment goal that Carwina was talking about what students were going to be doing at various stages of the cases that we were giving them, and how could we match up the skills that we were teaching them to mirror it, so they had the basics, the concepts that they could start applying at the time that they needed to start applying them. And then we would, of course, be giving them feedback in class and then also outside of class. So that's kind of big picture what I was thinking, but then I'm going to zoom in on our interviewing class. So for the kind of particular topic, I always start out by asking myself, in order to kind of think about my learning goal, is like, what are the key things that someone needs to understand? What are the key concepts in order to practice this skill, if it's a learning skill? And also, what are some of the common misunderstandings or mistakes that people make? I teach at least 3 interviewing classes, and one of them is focused on language access and kind of collaborating with interpreters and how to work best together in that setting. And it's usually, I'm preparing students for their first interview. And so some of the problems and assumptions and mistakes that students often make, they often, we're working with volunteer interpreters, they often haven't set out how they plan to work together. They haven't had a pre-meeting with the interpreter. They haven't made sure there's like common understandings about how they'll work together, how they might communicate as they go, basic, best practices, speaking in first person, not summarizing, not expanding, and then there are other things, how to be active listeners. Students wanted to follow this script that they've created instead of really listening to what their client is saying and going from there. Not sure how to explain their role, not sure how to accurately describe confidentiality and their obligations to their client. Also being unsure how to respond to trauma and sensitive topics when they arise. And then we also saw all sorts of dynamics between clinic partners, between students and clients, in terms of power dynamics and privilege, microaggressions that might occur. A common thing that we would sometimes see is a gender dynamic. If there was like a male and female partner, there might be the male partner kind of taking up more space in the interview and sometimes kind of tasking his partner with more administrative tasks and her accepting that role. And so those were some of you can kind of read some of the goals that we came up with and thinking about what we wanted students to get out of the class. So then you have to think about what's the pre-class assignments and work that can be done to help set people up for the learning. And so this is an example of a syllabus. We had students reading Munir Ahmad's Interpreting Communities, which is really helpful in thinking about the role of different stakeholders and how people can collaborate to better represent clients and communities. We also just had a very short best practices and interpretation worksheet. In the prior class, we had lots of readings. We had a selection from Margaret Johnson and Carolyn Gross's lawyering book, particularly focused on interviewing as well. So we had a lot of tenants in the prior class as well. They also had an assignment to prepare for a simulated interview, which would be conducted in class. And they also had to draft a real interview plan for their first client interview. And so those were kind of the assignments pre-work. And then what do we do in the class? I just came up with this list of some kind of signature experiential pedagogical tools, different ways of thinking about different exercises. Again, you want to think about alignment, as Carwina was saying, like what's going to best serve these students in trying to practice these skills and concepts and engage with them. But here are a few different ideas. you know, you may be familiar with many of these, just kind of brainstorming around what our client, what our goals are, or what our client's goals might be for the interview. A quick write where you give a prompt and then have people come up with ideas, and then you can kind of have them share and explore different concepts. Sometimes with interviewing, people do fishbowl with modeling, where, you know, you might be in the middle of the classroom with a student, and they're all kind of watching as you do a practice interview, or perhaps they're taking turns asking you as the client questions, and so they're all engaged in it at the same time, but they're all watching at the same time, as opposed to a simulation where people might be off in different breakout rooms or actual rooms doing an exercise. We often like to do simulations or even just a role play. And then, of course, you may feel that, you know, a lecture combined with some of these tools is going to be the best way. So in our class, we did a mini lecture. Then we watched a video that Professor Lindsay Harris and I developed together, the legal interviewing and language access videos. I'm happy to share that resource at some point as well. We can throw it in the chat. But it was a simulated a clinic student interview of a client, and we had one working with an interpreter as well, where the client just brought along her brother, and there were a lot of problems that hadn't been really planned for. And we use that video for students to kind of stop the video at various points, talk about the problem that they're seeing based on what the readings they're doing, and then role play what they might do if they were in that situation, as well as kind of go backwards and say, how might we plan to have a different outcome at this point. So that's the class. And then the second half of the class, the students are engaged in a simulated interview, which they record so we can all see it. But then also I have them paired with attorneys, as well as myself in one of the cases, to give real feedback at the time. And then we also give feedback to students with their real interview plans. So that's kind of the class structure that fits, and that's how we give feedback at the end. So I think that will turn us over back to my partner.
Thank you. So what you were hearing from Laila is how she actually builds out a unit. And we break that into three basic parts, right? The beginning, the middle, the end, nice and simple. Beginning, you're thinking about, what did our students already know? What can we build on? What can we scaffold from their existing knowledge? And then what resources are they going to need? What learning resources, for example, will they need to make their way through the unit? So it might be the videos and the books that Laila is suggesting. It might be podcasts. It might be a quick little pretest so you'll know what they're doing and give them a sense of baseline for their own self-development. In the middle, that's the bulk of the unit. This is where we're doing all of that learning activity. And as Laila says, it happens everywhere. It can be in the classroom, it can be in the client work, it can be the supervision. Frankly, with your enduring understandings, it could be as they're talking to each other and in their other classes as well, because they're using the information you give them everywhere. And then at the end of a unit, the end of your class, obviously you want to know how they're doing. So you give the assessment. It may be still formative as part of what's happening towards the end of the course when you have to grade, feedback, and then next steps. So the students have a sense of, again, how each unit connects to the next one, and therefore how each will build toward the learning outcomes and goals you've set for the course, right? What we'd like you to do, therefore, is to take one unit, either reflection or persuasion, think about the goals that you've already started drafting, hopefully, in the earlier section, and in your group, start to build out a unit that would align with the learning outcomes and the goal that you've selected for that unit. Okay. Laila, next slide then, so we can sort of see where that goes. Oops. You're also going to assign a scribe or reporter. Hopefully we will give you enough time. I will give you enough time to come back and share what you've done and then sketch that out. Again, it's easiest to think about this in three parts: what the students will have at the beginning of the unit and what they're going to actually need to go through the unit, a bunch of different learning activities, and the way you're going to assess them at the end. Okay. I'm going to open up breakout rooms. They're just basically named as either persuasion or reflection. please choose the unit that you want and start at the first one, like the earliest in the list of that, so that you end up with about 3 people in each section, in each room. If you see that one room already has 3 people, please move on to the next one. That way, hopefully everyone will have plenty of opportunity in classes, in the small breakouts, to talk and to work on building out a unit. And if you have questions, please remember you can always just ask for help or come back into the main room, and Laila and I and Nicole will be here in case there are any questions. You will also have until, let's say, 11:55. Come back around then. We'll close the rooms a little before then so that we can get some feedback from you. I think we've lost a lot of people.
Should we just assign the remaining?
I suspect some of them are just not here. Like they may be lurking or they're not actually at their desks. Could you see, I mean, a lot of, yeah, I've moved some people where they were in a room by themselves.
We can assign you to
Yep.
to a room. I think we just assign everyone who's left. Maybe they're not sure how to join.
That could be. Yeah, I think people are sort of waiting for the. Okay. Well, those of you who are left, is there anything that I'm sorry, I went through way fast, but is there anything that you think we should be focusing on as part of this, or if you're facilitating anything that would be helpful?
I think this was really great. I mean, I used it myself. We're going to be doing for the first time a boot camp for our part-time evening students. So I copied your URLs. I'm going to share them in the small group for those who went to the other session. I think it's really great. Like, you packed so much into such a short period of time. So.
Too much.
No,
Thank
no,
you.
I think it was great. Thank you.
It might be good flagging for the folks when they come back that you do the workshop at the AALS, so that that could be something that, you know, they may be on the lookout for next year.
Great idea.
Yeah, that's assuming we do it. I have to admit, I'm getting tired of it.
Maybe we'll say often offered. And the new clinicians also have more sessions, so just at the regional ones. So we made
Right.
kind of a reminder to, if they want a second round, there are some great opportunities.
No, and I'll put in. We have a unit 1 as well. We started these little podcasts because we didn't want to teach a 4-hour Zoom workshop this year. We just thought that would be so terrible for us and for anyone who actually showed up. So we have these little podcasts that they can use.
And I created just a resource link in the Google Drive where I've been like putting all of the things you guys have mentioned today. So it's all there too.
I'm going to send you
Okay.
another one then, Nicole. That's just
So reflection, I'm gonna join back in.
oh, okay. This is SHC Work iPhone.
Yeah, I had to log off this.
Right. I remember seeing that. I was just like, wait, I'm hearing voices. No. Sorry.
Okay,
Let me switch over to that then.
thank you.
And you said reflection.
Yes, please.
Okay. I would actually love anybody's feedback on these little videos. I've never done this before as part of teaching. So I don't know.
I actually
Curious how they
watched
work.
them. I thought they were super helpful. I
Okay.
wasn't able to, I signed up for the AALS thing and I couldn't attend. So I watched those videos and I found them to be really clear and useful.
Great.
And I like it because I was able to like go back to certain things as I was working through stuff. So I thought that
Right. It works like we tell people it
Yeah.
works. It still is the hardest thing to get it down to a very short video. Okay, I am going to start closing the rooms. Okay. All right, welcome back, everyone, and thank you. I know we've crammed an awful lot into this 1 hour, and if you stay on to do one of the smaller working groups, we have suggested that the facilitators give you time to practice this some more. I'm also going to put back into chat, and Nicole's adding to the clinicians conference Google Drive some of those video podcasts just in case they are helpful before this one. This one also is being recorded, of course, and will be available. I'd like to ask for a volunteer from one of the persuasion units and one from the reflection units to report back a little bit about what their goals and outcomes were and some of the activities that they've done to say, let us see perhaps how you've aligned your learning activities with your goals and outcomes. So a volunteer? Because otherwise I'm going to have to randomly call on people, and we all hate that, don't we? Especially since I don't know where you ended up. Yanira, are you still with us? And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm still here. Hi. So I'll try to remember, but I wasn't the scribe, so I didn't write it down. Oh,
You can point out who your scribe is.
I think that Amy wrote it in the
Yeah, just chat. I put it in the chat, you know.
All right, Amy, would you like to help out?
Students will be cognizant. Oh, I don't know. I don't mind reading it because she wrote it, so that's great.
Could you identify which unit you were in? Were you doing reflection or persuasion?
Persuasion.
Okay, so.
Okay, so students will be cognizant of role of attorneys. Students will communicate with clients. Students will be able to demonstrate active listening in order to understand positions of both parties. Students will be able to obtain favorable offers for clients and negotiations from prosecutors and adversaries. So these are some of the ones that everyone shared.
Okay, so these are essentially learning outcomes. Let's think about this, and people should just feel free to either holler out live, orally, or in chat. With learning outcomes, we want to see if they are observable and measurable. So we want very concrete verbs. So I'm seeing cognizant of role, communicate, demonstrate active listening with a reason why, obtain favorable offers. What do people think? Are these things, if you looked at those as a student, would you have a pretty clear sense of what you're expected to do in a persuasion unit?
Meh.
You can do
I
raise
think
a
we
thumbs.
did
I think
okay.
so. I think that
We
these
ran out
are
of
pretty
time.
clear. I think cognizant might be a little bit stranger. Like, are you asking, because you want to think about observable. So how is a student going to show you that they are in fact cognizant of their role, right? That's something that might be a little bit less clear because the verb there is be cognizant. And we might want to think about more descriptively for a student what that means. How are you going to be cognizant? Are you going to go in and say, I'm an attorney, right? You know, I mean, that would be great. You could do your Wonder Woman power pose, whatever it is, but that may not be what you're actually looking for as the instructor. So communicate with clients or actively listen. Those might be a little bit clearer, but we might want to think about some of the other words. And then what would be some of the activities you'd want in order to show that they are actively listening? All right, that would be your next step. You might give them resources on what active listening is. You might give them sample videos so that they can see how students in role are listening to their clients. You might give them bad examples as well as good examples, and they have to critique it and come up with different ways of listening actively, okay? Students will be able to obtain favorable offers for client and negotiations from prosecutor or adversary, right? That is a big one, right? That's the mega one. Be careful with those as a learning outcome is the only thing. It's very, very specific, right? So you can see what that would look like. But it's also something that's harder to, it's like the ultimate assessment, right? In some ways. You want to be careful of those because that is like the assignment. Their goal is to do that, but you also don't want to necessarily punish a student, as it were, for not getting that, because some of that will not be in their control, but will be, it may be depend on how you're reading defining what favorable is. Like we obviously know, for example, in criminal defense context, there may still be some jail time, or it may be you're going to do something that's careful for their immigration status, but it may not be, I've persuaded the prosecutor to drop the charges. So there's still some wiggle room in that. We want to make sure that the students know that this is a skill that they're building towards rather than the ultimate process, perhaps. But these are really nice and clear in terms of student understanding of what's expected of them. Great. How about someone from the reflection side? Since I don't know now which one of you were in the reflection, I'm going to have a scribe volunteer. Oh, wait, actually, I think, Chipa, were you in the reflection piece or the persuasion? I should go back to my chat and see who asked to be placed somewhere.
I did, but I joined late.
Oh,
The last,
okay,
like,
that's
5
right.
minutes, yeah.
Lauren, you were in reflection, if you are still here. Lauren somehow knew I was going to call on her. I didn't. Okay. Priya, try to see who's here.
I never joined a room because I would
Oh.
be.
All right, just because there are only 3 minutes left, I'm going to let the reflection side off the hook this time and maybe just open it up for questions then. Does anybody have any questions generally for us?
Feel free to just go ahead and raise your hand, or you can also put it in the chat.
And Laila, maybe we can stop sharing the screen so we can see everyone. Thank you. All right, then just as a summary then, I mean, the main thing is to remember, this is an iterative process. You can jump in almost at any point. Maybe there is a learning activity, for example, that you really like. And if you unpack why you really like it, what it really prepares your students to be able to do, maybe it's because it's so important to you, and that's really where you want to situate your goal and your alignment. Okay, but don't choose an activity just because it's fun. Like in the K-12 world, they'll say, oh, maybe we're talking about apples, understanding how apples work. And you don't say, we're going to bake a pie because that's fun, unless you want to actually connect that to a learning goal, like understanding how people use apples or why apples are food, that kind of thing. But make sure you just go around the complete circle of alignment at some point and test it out on someone who doesn't know your area well. It's often best actually, and get one of your doctrinal colleagues to look at and say, hey, can you understand what's expected here? Because if they can follow what you're doing, your students hopefully will be able to also.
Hey,
And then
Carwina, I just want to jump in real quick because there's a question in the chat that was really good and kind of related,
Wonderful.
which is whether or not you're communicating goals and learning outcomes to students. We need in our remaining seconds, you could answer
I think that's a great question. I was going to say a word. Yes, absolutely. I put it in my syllabus. I also use it as a prompt for students to reflect, write reflection papers, a self-assessment at various points, because naming the goals helps them internalize and think and learn. There's science about kind of like saying, well, this is what we're about to do, and then talking about how we might reach that goal helps them in the learning. So it's a really great question, and I would say yes, 1,000 times yes.
And the ABA requires you to put your learning outcomes into your syllabus now. So absolutely do that. And you will use them as well in rubrics. We didn't talk about rubrics, but that's sort of how you're scoring each assessment. That's often where the students are most likely to look because they want to get that A somehow.
Well, great. That was a lot in a very short period of time. And I'm seeing lots of thank yous coming in through the chat. So we really appreciate it. And best of luck to all of the new clinicians here, and enjoy your final small group session. Thank you.
Thank you.